Right, good morning. Thanks for joining us for the Food Safety Modernization Act Preventive Controls Rule Current Good Manufacturing Practices webinar. We're excited to have another webinar with Dr. Erin Dicaprio from the University of California, Davis. And we are going to get started with the official presentation soon, but first I'm going to go over a few quick housekeeping items. And just to let you know, we're going to turn off video during the presentation, but we'll come back on for the question and answer sessions. And just want to let you know, there are faces behind the voices. So we'll be off video for a little bit, but be back soon. So my name is Megan Donovan. I will be your host today. Behind the scenes, we have Larissa Hernandez providing technical assistance. She'll be the one fielding questions when they come in and may hop on as an alternative host if any technical issues should arise. The CCOF Foundation is pleased to collaborate with our partners to host today's webinar. Guided by the wisdom of our farming roots, the CCOF Foundation unites the organic community to advance organic agriculture. We offer intentional education, financial support, and growth opportunities for organic professionals. We wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a Food Safety Outreach Program grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Please note the contents of the webinar do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA, and also note this webinar is not providing legal advice. This is the fourth webinar in our four-part FSMA 101 for Organic Processor series. If you missed the first three webinars, visit the CCOF website for links to the recordings. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't see or can't hear, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. And finally, a quick Zoom tutorial. I'm sure most folks are Zoom experts by this point, but I don't know, I sometimes find I'm still learning things about Zoom, so we'll just do a quick review. To see the Zoom webinar controls, move your mouse over the image of the shared screen. If you're in the full screen viewing mode and would prefer to view the webinar in a window, click on the View Options tab at the top of the shared screen and select Exit to Full Screen Mode to exit the full screen. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. To send in questions or to communicate with webinar staff, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the shared screen. The question and answer box will pop open. Write your questions or comments in the field at the bottom of the box and click Send. If you would like to send your question anonymously, check the Send Anonymously box to the left. And note, we won't be using the chat function during this webinar, so if you have anything you need to communicate to webinar staff, just go ahead and use the question and answer box. And feel free to send in questions at any time. We'll collect them and use them during our question and answer breaks. At the end of the webinar, an invitation to take our webinar evaluation survey will pop up. To take the survey, click on the link and answer a few quick questions to help us improve our offerings. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded. We'll send a link to the recording along with the PDF of the slides to all webinar registrants. And just to note, we had over 100 people sign up for this webinar. So we're going to try to get to as many questions and comments as possible. And we just apologize in advance if we don't get to your specific question and to encourage you to follow up after the webinar. And thanks again for attending. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Erin Dicaprio, who is an assistant specialist in cooperative extension in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis. Her area of expertise is in microbial food safety with an emphasis on foodborne viruses. So Erin, thank you so much, and I will turn things over to you.
Thanks, Megan, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. And so today we're kind of closing the circle, if you will, on the FSMA 101 webinars, focusing in today on current good manufacturing practices, or GMPs. So what we're going to cover today is essentially, a general overview of prerequisite programs, including the GMPs, and then we'll go into more detail on specific areas covered by good manufacturing practices. If you joined any of the previous webinars, I tried to hit on kind of continually that these GMPs are really the foundation, the basis for your food safety program as a food processor, regardless of whether or not your food processing operation has any exemptions under the preventive controls rule for human food. These good manufacturing practices are going to apply to your operation. So if you're a qualified facility under the preventive controls rule, one of the requirements of being a qualified facility is that you implement good manufacturing practices. So hopefully today gives you a better sense of what's required under the regulation and what these GMPs cover. So you'll see a lot of use of this term prerequisite programs in different food safety training programs and the regulatory language. And these prerequisite programs are essentially the procedures that you implement that provide the very basic environmental and operating conditions necessary to support the production of safe food. So good manufacturing practices fall under this general umbrella of prerequisite programs. Again, the GMPs are defined within the food safety regulations. So those are prerequisite programs you're required to implement, but you may have some additional programs in your facility based on your specific operations outside of what's in the GMPs. So focusing in on what the requirements are under the good manufacturing practices. So GMPs have been around for a very long time. And they were actually updated with the implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act. So the GMPs used to be under a different federal regulation, but now they fall under 21 CFR 117, so preventive controls for human food, and the GMPs are in subpart B of that particular part of the regulation. And so here are highlighted the different areas that these GMPs cover. So this covers the requirements for personnel working in your facility, the plant and grounds, so essentially the building itself and surrounding areas, sanitary operations, which focus very heavily on cleaning and sanitizing within your food processing operation, sanitary facilities and controls. So those are things like making sure you have a potable water source and a fully functioning sewage system. This also applies to any equipment or utensils you're using in your operation, any processes or controls that are being implemented in the operation, warehousing and distribution. So it's not only the production portion of your facility, but any warehousing operations you might have, as well as if you're using any vehicles to distribute that product. This may not apply to many folks, but these GMPs now also are extended to cover any human food byproducts that are intended to be used as animal food. So there's now specific requirements for how you need to protect some of those waste streams that are going to be used for animal feed down the line, and also defect action levels, which I'll touch on, but there are certain products and ingredients that have certain defined levels of impurities that are allowable, and those are housed under these good manufacturing practices as well. So there's two of these areas that have an asterisk next to them, because depending on your specific operation, the products you're producing, there may be certain activities that would fall under sanitary operations or processes and controls that may need to be elevated to a preventive control. So you've identified a hazard that you're going to control by some process. You're going to have to implement preventive control at that step. But I'll give some examples of when some of these GMPs may be elevated to the level of requiring a preventive control. The first thing I want to touch on is training. So training is really critical to implementing not only your GMPs, but your broader food safety plan. And I think it's something that for, smaller processors can be a challenge just due to time constraints and things like that. But it is a requirement under the Preventive Controls for Human Food Regulation that your employees receive some basic level of food safety training if they're going to be handling human food. And so the level of training is going to be dependent on the person's role within the business. The regulation doesn't specifically define what exact training is required, but kind of at the bare minimum, folks should receive basic information on food safety, how to mitigate risks. They should receive information on personal hygiene practices to help minimize food safety risks. And then whatever, their specific duties are, if those duties have, any overlap with food safety implementation, they need to receive specific training related to that activity as well. And so this is what is stated in the regulation. So food handlers and supervisors should receive appropriate training in proper food handling techniques and food protection principles. So again, the type of training required is going to vary based on someone's duties, but at a minimum, they need to receive training on general food safety concerns, how, insanitary practices can lead to food safety issues, and how personal hygiene plays a really important role in ensuring food safety. So why do we want to do the training? Well, first and foremost, it is required by the regulations. And so an inspector in your facility is going to be looking for documentation that training has occurred for staff that are handling food. Beyond that, this training is going to provide your employees with a background in food safety knowledge that will help them better understand why they're being asked to follow the specific procedures that you've outlined in standard operating procedures, whether it's, hand washing procedures or cleaning and sanitizing procedures. Giving your employees the background for why those activities are so important can really help empower them and motivate them to implement those practices, because it does have a direct impact on the safety of the food that you're manufacturing. So what should be covered in the training? So personal hygiene, very important. So training on proper hand washing procedures, requirements for clothing in the facility, wearing hairnets, things like that should be covered in the training. Also really important to emphasize that individuals that are sick should not be coming to work and handling food. We as humans are a great source of some of these contaminants that can lead to foodborne illness. So very important that when we are sick, we're not coming to work and potentially going to be contaminating food we're handling during operations. And then also really important to emphasize, and some basic training material are sanitary operations. So things like cleaning and sanitizing equipment, utensils, food contact surfaces in the facility, and emphasizing how that's really important to minimize food safety risks. But again, depending on someone's role within the operation, there may be additional training beyond these basic concepts that are required. As with anything under these regulations, it's very important to have documentation showing that employees have received this training. So you would want to have, a sign-in list or log for people when you host these trainings, and have people sign their name, provide a date for when the training occurred, so that an inspector can look at that record and verify that, yes, these employees have been trained on basic food safety concepts. The first part covered under good manufacturing practices is personnel. And I think, a lot of this is kind of common sense information related to what we as humans handling food can do to help minimize the risk of us introducing hazards into a processed food product. So very important, as I already mentioned, that folks that are sick are not directly handling food or working in the food processing environment. That's explicitly stated within the GMPs. So you need to have a policy in place that does, ensure that folks that are sick aren't handling food. Hand washing is covered under the personnel portion of the good manufacturing practices. Also, if you're working in a food processing environment, you're restricted from wearing jewelry. You should also, not have any, artificial press-on fingernails, things that can fall off your person into a food product. That's considered a potential physical hazard. So under the good manufacturing practices, there are, restrictions on jewelry, false nails. Also, hair restraints are required. So this includes a hairnet, as well as a beard net for those that have facial hair. In the food processing area, there should also be, no personal items stored in the production areas. I carry a handbag, and, that touches multiple surfaces outside of my office space, and who knows what could be on the outside of that handbag. So those kinds of personal items should not be coming into the processing area because they could introduce some hazards. Of course, no eating, drinking, or tobacco use in the production area. And something that I see that's sometimes an issue in smaller processing operations is just related to clothing or garb that are being worn on the production floor. So, if you're using, an apron in the production area, making sure that those are cleaned routinely. If street clothes are being worn, those should also be clean and not, be carrying any soil or other debris that might introduce a hazard. I'm sure everyone is familiar with hand washing, but within the GMPs, there are specific directions for when hand washing needs to occur. So this is before anyone enters the production area. Anytime someone would leave and re-enter the production area, they're required to wash their hands. Of course, after you use the restroom, after any coughing, sneezing, blowing your nose, hands need to be washed again. And after returning from lunch or doing any, eating or smoking, hands need to be washed again. And hand washing is really, really critical for help minimizing transmission of pathogens we might be harboring onto foods. Also really important to minimize allergen cross-contact risk. There was one recall where an employee was eating some puffed cheese snacks on break, didn't wash their hands before they came back onto the production floor, and introduced cheese, a milk allergen, onto product that was being run in the facility. So hand washing, really, really critical. These are the basic steps for proper hand washing. So you want to wet your hands using potable water. Then you would add liquid soap, scrub for 20 seconds, followed by rinsing and drying of the hands. So the best practice for drying is to use a single-use disposable paper towel. You're not allowed to have, a cloth hand drying rag that, every employee is going to use, because, the first person may introduce maybe they didn't properly wash their hands and they introduced some kind of contaminant that then every single person that reused that towel would then have on their hands. Also, that cloth towel is going to become, wet after a point in time, which can also potentially, lead to some risks. So best practice, single-use paper towels, but you can also use a hand dryer, forced air hand dryer in the absence of those paper towels. So gloves is something that I think can create some potential problems in the processing facility, simply because they're misused very frequently. If you are using gloves, the specific purpose for the rationale for why those gloves needs to be used should be reflected upon. Certainly, if you're doing some kind of cleaning with caustic chemicals, you would want gloves that provide protection to your employees. Likewise, if they're handling something that, may cut their skin, having gloves there for that protection is really important. But you want to make sure that those gloves are maintained in a fashion where they're not going to be serving as a source of contamination. So, they need to be clean and things of that nature. There are many processors that if there's any direct human contact with the food product, they'll use food contact grade gloves for those operations. So you do want to ensure that the gloves, if you're using them and contacting food, are labeled for such a purpose. But also with all gloves, the use of gloves is not a substitute for hand washing, and you need to take kind of the similar approach to frequency of hand washing and when you would replace gloves. So anytime you leave the production area, those gloves need to be replaced. Anytime you would cough or sneeze on those gloves, they need to be replaced. And, that's the part of glove use that can sometimes get folks into some trouble. So this is just kind of an overview of proper glove use. Again, glove use is not a substitute for hand washing. You still need to be washing your hands and doing that before you don the gloves. You want to ensure the gloves are clean before use. That's really simple. If you're using some of those disposable single-use gloves, but for other gloves that might be used for cleaning and sanitation or repairs of equipment and things, you need to have a process where you're monitoring the cleanliness of those gloves. Single-use gloves, they are single-use, which means they are not to be reused. Any glove that you're using that's soiled or torn needs to be replaced, and you have to be mindful of what those gloves touch. So if you're touching your face, or if you've touched a surface that isn't cleaned, look at that as being a source of contamination and replace those gloves in that situation. I know, in retail food establishments. I see a lot of people that are, pulling a pastry out of a case, wearing gloves, and then I hand them money and they're handling that money wearing the gloves. So, that money is a great potential source of contamination. So just be mindful of where those gloves are touching and replace them as necessary. Next, the GMPs have specific criteria for food manufacturing plants and grounds. And this is essentially, it applies to your building and also surrounding areas of that building. And it focuses on, minimizing pest intrusions, making sure there's no attractants for pests, having things like adequate lighting, and ensuring that if you have glass light bulbs in the facility, that those are protected from breakage, so you don't have a glass physical hazard ending up in a food product. There's also a requirement that the materials used for construction in the facility are made of a material that is cleanable. So your walls, floors, ceilings need to be constructed out of a material that you're able to clean. If you have any kinds of overhead piping or air conditioning units in the facility, if you have a cooler storage, a walk-in cooler, you need to make sure that there's not dripping or condensation from that equipment that may contaminate a product. So this part of the GMPs really focuses on the physical structure of your building and making sure that build material is able to be clean, that you have barriers to the outside so pests can't get in, making sure again that you don't have any condensation that could drip onto your product. And then on the exterior, making sure that you don't have any overgrown weeds or plants that might be a habitat for some of these pests that you want to keep out of your facility, making sure you don't have waste or water buildup outside of your facility that could attract some of these pests that we do not want in the production area. So I wanted to poll the group right here. So if you could just tell me what's wrong with this picture. So this would be, the loading dock outside of a production facility. So what's wrong here? Is it nothing? Is this totally fine to find outside of a processing facility? Is it the overflowing garbage outside the facility, mixed waste in this dumpster, or pest attraction? So we'll give you just another minute or two to respond. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and I'll share the results. So, the primary problem here is the overflowing garbage outside of the processing facility. So if this is what it looked like outside of your manufacturing operation, you would definitely get cited by an inspector. And the reason that we don't want to see waste like this outside of the processing facility is because it's a pest attractant. So those that answered pest attraction, right on point as well. And of course, you beyond pests, you could also have, other contaminants potentially, growing in this garbage. If you had an employee then that then walked through this garbage, they could bring it into your facility as well. So this is definitely something that we don't want to see outside of a processing facility. So next, one more quick poll. What's wrong with this picture? So this is a light fixture inside a food processing facility. So is nothing wrong with this picture here? Is There is the burnt out light bulb in the processing facility the issue, or is it unprotected glass in the processing facility? There's probably other things that you might think are wrong with this picture, but we're limiting your options for responses here. I'm going to end the poll and I'll share the results. So you guys are great. Obviously, there's something wrong here. So this is unprotected glass in a food processing facility, which is a major no-no. You know, luckily this bulb didn't break, but you could see that easily happening and glass ending up in product. Also, I can't speak to whether or not this light would turn on if we flip the switch, but within the GMPs, it's also a requirement that you have adequate lighting within the processing facility. So certainly a burnout light bulb would be an issue as well. Great job. All right. So moving on to sanitary operations. So these are covered under good manufacturing practices. There could be instances where your sanitary operation that you're implementing might be elevated to a preventive control if a specific type of hazard is identified during a hazard analysis. Those are primarily going to be instances where you have a risk of allergen cross contact in your facility. So if you have a product, say you're making cookies and you have two different varieties of cookies, they have essentially all the same ingredients with the exception of one of the cookies has the addition of walnuts. So walnuts are a tree nut, which are an allergen. So in that case, you would need to have a preventive control where you're cleaning and sanitizing that production line in between the cookie that has the walnut versus the cookie that does not. So in that case, that cleaning and sanitation step is controlling for an allergen ending up in a product that is not labeled to contain that allergen. So in this case, that would be a sanitation preventive control for minimizing allergen cross contact. You might also have a situation where you have a food product that is exposed to the environment post-kill step and identified an environmental pathogen as a hazard needing a preventive control. Again, there, your cleaning and sanitation would be a sanitation preventive control to minimize buildup of environmental pathogens. But generally, you know, beyond those instances where we have elevation to a preventive control, these are the kinds of things that need to be done under the GMPs related to sanitary operations. And, you know, this relates very heavily on the cleaning and sanitation of your facility. So food contact surfaces are those that need to be cleaned and sanitized on a frequent basis because the food is directly contacting those surfaces. And if they are not routinely cleaned and sanitized, there could be a risk of contamination for food that's contacting that surface. Non-food contact surfaces are, you know, those that foods aren't directly touching, but they're in the processing environment. And those types of surfaces also need to be cleaned and sanitized as necessary to help minimize, you know, the environmental impact on food being produced in that facility. You're going to be using a lot of different chemicals in cleaning and sanitation. And it's very important that those chemicals are stored appropriately and segregated from any food ingredients or materials that are going to be used in food production. So you want to make sure that those toxic chemicals are stored in a fashion where they're not going to pose a risk to the food being produced. So I want to focus in more on cleaning and sanitation, because I think especially for folks starting out or smaller processors, it can be a little bit tricky to kind of, understand the difference between cleaning and sanitation and the different methods that can be used for cleaning and sanitation. So for your food contact surfaces, this can also be a challenge if you're using some repurposed equipment. But these food contact surfaces that you have to clean and sanitize need to be smooth and easy to clean. So you want to ensure that whatever the food contact surface is, that it is a surface that you're able to adequately clean and sanitize. So things like stainless steel, plastics, those are typically going to be surfaces that are smooth and easy to clean and sanitize. Wood, porous, very difficult to clean and sanitize, and certainly not something that we want to see as a food contact surface in a production facility. So these food contact surfaces, these are the surfaces that you're going to most frequently clean and sanitize in your facility. Other surfaces, floors, walls, outside of equipment that's not contacting food directly, you're going to clean and sanitize those surfaces as well, but on a less frequent basis, most likely. As I already mentioned, situations where cleaning and sanitation may elevate to being a sanitation preventive control is when you're using that cleaning and sanitation step to prevent allergen cross contact, or when you're using cleaning and sanitation to minimize the risk of environmental pathogen buildup in the processing environment. So cleaning and sanitizing, I am trying to, emphasize those are two separate words. These are two different processes. So cleaning is the physical removal of dirt and debris from a surface. So this could be done using a brush or compressed air, sweeping, or you could also do this using some water and detergent. So cleaning, physical removal of dirt and debris. Sanitizing, on the other hand, is treatment of a clean surface to reduce or eliminate microorganisms from that surface. And so these use a specific type of chemical that is labeled as a sanitizer. These are often going to be labeled for use on food contact surfaces versus a non-food contact surface. So you need to make sure you're picking a sanitizer that's labeled for use on a food contact surface if you're using it on a food contact surface. And something really important to emphasize is you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. So you have to clean that surface before you sanitize, because any residual dirt or debris that is on a surface is going to minimize the effectiveness of that sanitizer that you apply. So clean first, then sanitize. These are the basic steps to take to clean and sanitize a food contact surface. And this would be what we consider a wet cleaning and sanitizing regime. So the first step is to remove dirt and debris from the surface. So you could use a brush or a cloth to remove, visible large dirt and debris. The second step is to clean using a detergent and scrub the surfaces. And then if you are using a detergent, you want to rinse that surface using potable water. After you've rinsed off that detergent completely, next you would apply your sanitizer. Very important here, if this is a food contact surface, you use a sanitizer that is labeled for use on a food contact surface, and that you follow those labeled directions exactly. So you should have an SOP that states the specific sanitizer that you're using on a specific food contact surface, and have the procedure follow exactly what those label directions are in terms of diluting the sanitizer, how you apply that sanitizer, if there's a dwell time, so a length of time that sanitizer has to sit on the surface before it's considered sanitized, making sure that is followed. Some sanitizers you may have on that label directions to rinse the sanitizer off after use. So very important to follow those label directions exactly. Another really important, I think, procedure for organic processors, if you're using a sanitizer that you haven't previously checked in with your certifier is appropriate for use in an organic operation, you do want to check in with your certifier to make sure that the sanitizer that you're using is appropriate for use in an organic operation and that the procedure that you're using is in line with those organic standards. So that there are certain kinds of chemistries that you can use in organic operations that require additional post-sanitation steps to make sure that chemical is fully removed from food contact surfaces prior to running your organic product on that equipment or on that line. So we'll touch on that a little bit later as well. So there's two basic methods for cleaning and sanitizing, dry versus wet. So a dry cleaning and sanitizing program would be used in facilities that are considered dry operations. So this would be places like, if you're milling flour or handling tree nuts, that's a dry operation, and you don't want to introduce water in a facility that's considered dry because water is required for microbial growth. So if you can avoid water in your facility, that's a good thing. So dry cleaning is accomplished using physical means. So this could be vacuuming, using compressed air to blow debris out, sweeping, wiping with a dry cloth. And then typically the sanitizers used in dry cleaning and sanitizing operations are alcohol-based. And so that sanitizer will evaporate off the surface very quickly. Wet cleaning and sanitizing is certainly the most common. And in wet cleaning, you're using water in the cleaning and process. So using water and your detergent to clean a surface and then rinsing that surface off. Also, your sanitizer is going to be a liquid, and you're likely going to be diluting that sanitizer in water and applying that to your surface. And you may, depending on the sanitizer you're using, also be using water to remove that residual sanitizer from the surface after that dwell time has passed. And then there are what are called clean in place and clean out of place cleaning and sanitation. And this is based on the type of equipment that you're using. So cleaning in place means you're cleaning that equipment right there as it stands. So this is for equipment that can't be fully broken down to clean and sanitize. So oftentimes you're going to have sanitizer and cleaning solution and sanitizer that is pumped through this system. And so some of the things to think about if you're, cleaning in place is the concentration of the sanitizer, the flow rate of the sanitizer through the system, the temperature of that sanitizer. And so all of those things are going to be outlined in your standard operating procedure for cleaning and sanitizing this piece of equipment that is clean in place. I will say that, one of the drawbacks of cleaning in place, this can be ineffective if there's residual food buildup within the system. So just be aware if you're cleaning in place, you might need to do that at a higher frequency so you minimize that residual food buildup within the system. In contrast, clean out of place, this is for equipment that can be taken apart or have parts removed prior to cleaning and sanitation. Some considerations here. This typically requires significant time to break down the equipment. This is normally done at what we call a clean break. So if you're not familiar with a clean break, this is when you have a complete stoppage of product running on that line, on that piece of equipment. You break down that equipment, thoroughly clean, sanitize that equipment, that product line. And this is what's used to determine different lots of products. So having that clean break where you're fully breaking down the line, cleaning and sanitizing is used to make that lot to lot determination. So for cleaning out of place, sanitizer concentration is again important, and the temperature of the sanitizer may also be important as well, depending on the chemistry that you're using. For organic processors, so you're going to have a more restrictive list of cleaning and sanitizing products that you can use. So here are a few useful links to help give you some ideas of the types of products that are allowable. For some sanitizers used in organic operations, there is an additional requirement for a rinsing step to remove that residual chemical. So one very common class of sanitizers used in the food industry are quaternary ammonium compounds, or quats. And so for organic processors, you can use some of these quats, but if you do, they are chemicals that will require that additional rinsing step. So if you're not sure, if you're thinking of switching to another chemistry, check in with your certifier. They'll be able to tell you, number one, is that chemistry allowed? If so, are there any special procedures, considerations that you need to implement if you're using that particular chemistry? So I want to engage you guys again here. And so we're going to launch another poll. This is a cabinet dryer, very commonly used in the food industry to dehydrate food. And so I'd like you guys to tell me, what is the food contact surface for this cabinet dryer? Is it the outside of the dryer, the inside walls of the dryer, or the surface of those dryer trays? So it's a bit hard to see in the photo, but in the diagram, you can see there are these wire racks where the food is sitting as it's being dried. Give you a couple more minutes, seconds, not minutes. I'm gonna end the poll, share the results. So very good. So the surface of the dryer trays are the food contact surface for this cabinet dryer. So the food's not directly contacting the walls of the dryer, but certainly, we would want to ensure that those walls are cleaned and sanitized frequently, but the dryer trays are our primary focus when it comes to cleaning and sanitizing this particular piece of equipment. So this cabinet dryer, very similar to, if you have a home food dehydrator, it functions in a very similar manner, but, hot air is used to dry the food, and a fan in this piece of equipment circulates that air through those perforated trays to help dry the food. And so in terms of cleaning and sanitation, those trays can be pulled out and removed from the cabinet dryer. So those are cleaned out of place using wet cleaning and sanitation, whereas the inside walls of that dryer, obviously you can't take those off and clean and sanitize. So those are going to be cleaned in place using dry cleaning and sanitation. So we don't want to introduce water into our food dehydrator. Some issues to look out for in this type of equipment. First is the fans that are used to circulate the air can sometimes get some buildup of food debris, dust. And so you don't ever want any kind of standing debris in your food processing equipment. So making sure that you're checking those periodically, cleaning them, sanitizing them as needed. Another issue that commonly comes up as a problem for effective sanitation is damaged equipment. So on those metal trays, you could imagine maybe that grate peels up a little bit from the base of the tray. And so you have this little crevice that then becomes very difficult to clean and sanitize effectively. And those areas that are problematic for effective cleaning and sanitation are what we term kind of generally as harborage sites for microorganisms to build up. And actually sometimes you can have biofilm formation or these communities of microorganisms build up in those harborage sites. So if you do notice, and if it's a cabinet dryer or some other piece of equipment that you have some damage, or there are other potential harborage sites, like if there's a gouge or a scratch on a surface or a bad weld, that you minimize those harborage sites as much as possible on your equipment so you can effectively clean and sanitize. So one more poll here. This is a holding tank for a liquid product, and I'd like you to identify the food contact surface here. So this is the exterior of the tank and the liquid comes in, and here's the port where it comes out. Is it the outside of the tank that's the food contact surface, or the inside of the tank? I see the responses flying in. Good job. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now and share the results. So the inside of the tank of this holding tank is where the food is going to be contacting this particular piece of equipment. Here we'd have, some kind of piping coming out where the liquid would come and be fed, to a bottler or some other piece of equipment. So there would not be any direct contact with the outside of that tank. So this particular holding tank, and this is, I think, fairly common for many processors of juice. We actually have a holding tank with what's called spray balls in our pilot scale brewery. So these spray balls, they're attached to the top of this holding tank, and they're used to clean and sanitize the inside of that holding tank during using a clean in place operation. So these spray balls sit on top of the tank, and they're going to be spraying high velocity water and chemicals during cleaning and sanitation. So these, obviously, I already mentioned, are clean in place because we have these spray balls attached to the holding tank. Very important: sanitizer, concentration, temperature, and the velocity or the flow rate of that chemical coming out of the spray balls. Some things to look out for here, similar to any food contact surface, is looking for any scratching or pitting on that surface. That would be a harborage site. For this particular type of clean in place system, making sure those spray balls are positioned properly so you get adequate coverage within the tank when those the spray balls are active. Tanks as well, it's important to make sure that the tank design allows for adequate drainage. So I'll just go back to this previous picture. So in this holding tank, you see the port for product to come out is here, but there's, a significant amount of space left at the bottom of this tank where we could have product just sitting there at the bottom that wouldn't be able to flow out. So you want to make sure that these holding tanks do allow for drainage, total drainage of a product out, because if you have that residual product sitting there, it could not only impact the safety of product being held in that tank, but also the quality. So we'll pause here, and I'm happy to take any questions that folks have.
Great, thank you, Erin, and thank you for the polls to kind of keep us on our toes this morning. So yeah, if folks have questions, please go ahead and send them in. We did have a question about a list of chemicals that organic processors can use. So I think the OMRI list and the WSDA list that we sent out is a really good place to start. And again, always check in with your certifier, because as Erin mentioned, a chemical may be approved, but there may be certain ways that you're required to use it in organic production. So it's always good to check in with your certifier. And then another question that I've had come up in sort of Produce Safety Alliance trainings with organic growers when we covered the hand washing section is, some folks were like, well, that's a lot of single-use paper towels, being used in my facility, and I'm an organic operation, and I'm trying to maintain and conserve natural resources. So I was wondering, have you seen creative ways that people sort of address that? I know, I think in that conversation, people were brainstorming sort of like towel cleaning protocols. So you have basically a single-use towel that again gets cleaned in a specific manner, or yeah, have you heard folks get kind of creative on that?
Yeah, and that's a tough one. So, the recommended best practice is the single-use paper towel, and I totally understand, the concerns around there. That's a lot of waste. But we do know that drying is really an important part of the hand washing process, and that, that physical drying can actually help remove microorganisms as well as debris. I think I haven't seen, any work around, an intervention step if you were using a reusable towel that would be any less environmentally impactful than because if you imagine you're washing all of these reusable towels and things very frequently, I don't know how that balances out in terms of environmental impact. But I think the forced air dryers, might be kind of a nice in-between option. There have been some concerns around forced air dryers just because you don't necessarily have that physical interaction with the towel that does help remove some debris, microorganisms, and also that air, if you had residual microorganisms on your hands, some of those high velocity air dryers, that blow your hair up when you put your hands in, can actually spread some of those around. So, in terms of a eco-friendly towel solution, I don't have a good answer for that.
All right, thank you. And then another question that came in was, do you have any suggestions for a detergent for a dry facility?
A detergent for a dry facility. So I think maybe they mean a sanitizer for a dry facility, because typically if you're a dry facility, your cleaning step isn't going to include a detergent. You're going to be using vacuums or air or sweeping to remove the debris. I don't have any any specific product recommendations. I think on our UC food safety website, which may not be included in the resource list for today's presentation, but I think we could add it when the email goes out to folks. We do have some resources specific to processors, and one is for companies that manufacture sanitizers. So that might be, a good place to start. I will kind of give the disclaimer that generally the sanitizers for dry operations tend to be less effective than those that are used in wet cleaning and sanitizing operations. The dry chemistries are typically alcohol-based, and they just aren't quite as strong, and are a little less effective against certain target microorganisms that might be a concern. But we'll make sure that you have a link to that website, and hopefully that will help you find something that works for your operation.
Great, thanks. And just again, before using any chemistries, check in with your certifier to make sure they're approved for use and the way you're using them is approved as well. So I think we'll move on to the next part of the presentation, but if people have more questions, feel free to write those in and we'll loop back around to them at our final question and answer session.
All right, so moving on to sanitary facilities and controls. So this part of the GMPs really focuses on the infrastructure, I would say, of your facility, making sure that you have an adequate potable water supply, that your plumbing functions well, that you have sewer drainage, floor drainage, access to toilet facilities, hand washing facilities for your staff, and that you do have proper trash and waste disposal. So, some of this might, not be something that's under your direct control as a processor, but all of these things are explicitly stated as needing to be controlled in the regulation. So, working with, those external entities that may have a hand in this is really important. So water supply and plumbing. So there is a potential risk if you have non-potable water contacting your food. So you want to make sure that the water source that you're using for any kind of processing, including making ice. A lot of folks overlook ice, but it's considered a food ingredient, or it's often contacting food to cool things down. So it needs to be made from potable water. So, water supply, very, very important. If you're using municipal water sources, those are generally going to meet this potable water requirement, but you would want to check in and actually ask your municipal water source entity to give you some sort of documentation related to the quality of the water they're providing you. If you're using a well water source, then it is on you to make sure that you're doing adequate testing of that well water. If treatment's required, having records of both any water quality testing and any treatments you do on a well source. So water, really important to think about. And you will likely be showing an inspector some documentation to verify that the water source you're using is potable. Hand washing and toilet facilities. For both of these, both your hand washing stations and your toilet facilities, we have to make sure that they themselves are not going to be a contamination source. So having standard operating procedures for, the frequency of cleaning these types of facilities is really important. You might be using a shared use facility, or having some external company coming in and doing some of this cleaning for you. But you need to have records that this is occurring, and also a standard operating procedure that outlines the frequency of the cleaning of these facilities. Moving on now to equipment and utensils. So for any equipment or utensil that you're using, they need to be able to be cleaned, and your food contact surfaces sanitized, and stored in areas that are used for food production. So if you're using, let's say, spoons for some kind of mixing during production, you don't want those to migrate out into the break room. So people are using them for, personal use as well. Any equipment, utensils that you're using need to be corrosion resistant, and your food contact surfaces need to be made from non-toxic materials, meaning you don't want that food contact surface material migrating into your food products. So things like stainless steel, plastics, those aren't going to be, posing a risk of migration into your food product. If you have freezers and coolers that you're using for food production, those devices need to have a thermometer, a temperature indicating device, and ideally have some kind of alarm system that when or if that piece of equipment goes out of range of cooling, that you receive an alarm to alert you that, whatever ingredients are being stored there may now be out of proper temperature control, and you can mitigate that as quickly as possible. You may have some instruments that are monitoring different processes, and you need to make sure that those are properly maintained and that they're going to be accurately monitoring those processes. So again, making sure that temperature indicating device, the thermometer on your freezer, is functioning as intended. Next, we'll move on to processes and controls. And this is another one of the areas under the good manufacturing practices that, depending on what you're doing, some of these may elevate to requiring a process preventive control rather than being covered by your basic GMPs. So these generally apply to all of the things you're doing for quality control in your operation. So, making sure that things are adequately cleaned and sanitized, making sure equipment is functioning as intended. So all of that would fall under your processes and controls under the GMPs. Also, your raw materials and ingredients, so some basic standards for those, are also required under good manufacturing practices, as well as certain components of the manufacturing operation. So for raw materials and ingredients, it's in your best interest to always make sure that you're working with your supplier to make sure that the ingredients that you're receiving are of high quality and are not a potential source of a hazard, since you're going to be incorporating those into your product. All your raw materials and ingredients also need to be stored in a way that is going to prevent contamination or reduction in quality. It's really important to think about, if you have allergens in your facility, making sure you're segregating those allergenic ingredients from your non-allergenic ingredients. Similarly for organic, if you happen to be a processor that's making organic products as well as conventional, that you're segregating those organic raw materials from the conventional ingredients. In terms of manufacturing operations, there's kind of multiple things highlighted here. I think 2, 3, and 4 we've already touched on previously, but I want to just focus in here on the first one, because these are kind of the situations where you might have a GMP elevate to a preventive control. So preventing microbial growth during your manufacturing operations through cooking, time temperature control, water activity, pH. Some of these things may just be a GMP. So I'll give an example of that in the next slide. Other things, so if you're doing some kind of cooking, processing, using acid addition, for example, you're doing those things to mitigate a hazard. And so then those would actually elevate to being a process preventive control. So a couple examples here that I hope will clarify that a little bit. This can be the really tricky part of doing a hazard analysis, is figuring out, okay, what is going to be covered by my good manufacturing practices if they're implemented correctly, compared to what is going to be a preventive control where I have to implement, this specific validated process and have all of this additional documentation. So this, we'll get into hazard analysis in January if you're interested in getting more into the nitty-gritty of that whole process. But essentially, one of the first steps of that hazard analysis is developing a flow diagram that goes step by step by step through the entire process, from receiving ingredients for your product to that product leaving your facility. So here I've kind of pulled out a couple of steps from a flow diagram for a baked good. So the first step that I want to highlight here is storing pasteurized liquid eggs used as an ingredient in a baked product under refrigerated conditions. So I'm kind of making this up, but I'm a processor that makes only one type of baked good. So eggs are an allergen, so they should be on the label for my product. But because I'm only making this one type of baked good, I don't have any unique allergens in my facility. All my cookies have eggs in them. These are also pasteurized liquid eggs. So they've been through the supplier, a pasteurization process to minimize risks associated with microbial hazards. And I'm going to store this in the refrigerator to help minimize any potential growth of microorganisms that might have survived that pasteurization process. So here, storing those liquid eggs would fall under my good manufacturing practices. The next step I want to highlight here, which is also part of my manufacturing process, is cooking this product for a specific time and temperature. So very common method of a kill step or a step to reduce microbial pathogens of concern is cooking. And the cooking time and temperature selected should be shown effective to control whatever microbial hazard I've identified in this product. So in this step of my flow diagram, the cooking at a specific time and temperature is a process preventive control, so not a GMP. And then the last step I want to highlight here is packaging of these baked goods by hand. So people that work in my facility are going to be putting these cookies into a bag and sealing them up and doing that by hand. So, we as humans are a source of contaminants, right? So, potentially, those humans could be introducing a hazard. But if the folks in my facility are following the good manufacturing practices, dictating good personal hygiene practices, that hazard should be mitigated by my GMPs and not require this process preventive control. So it can get really hard, again, deciding what's covered by GMPs and what's covered by process preventive controls, but we'll get more into some of that nuance in the January webinar on hazard analysis. Warehousing and distribution is also covered by good manufacturing practices. So both in warehousing and distribution, You need to protect your product from microbial growth, allergen cross contact, contamination of the food with other hazards, or deterioration or quality losses, spoilage of that food in the container. And so you always want to store your products elevated, not directly on the ground. I think these packages look pretty nice. You can see they're in there. I'm guessing the box is even a secondary package, and there are containers within those boxes, and then they're wrapped in plastic wrap. And these actually, you can see, have allergen labels on the outside, so folks in that warehouse know these are allergenic products and they need to be segregated from other products during warehousing. Defect action levels. So some of you might be aware that there are FDA set maximum levels for natural or unavoidable defects in food that don't present a health hazard. So this is things like insect parts in raw flour, processing tomatoes have a certain level of mold that's allowable. So not all products have these set defect action levels, some do. And these are covered under good manufacturing practices. So if you have ingredients or a product that has one of these set maximum defect action levels, you need to be aware of that, but it doesn't also give you a free pass from establishing quality operations to reduce the levels of those particular defects that are allowed in your product, but only up to a specific maximum level. So some other prerequisite programs that may be applicable to your operation are hygienic zoning and ready-to-eat facilities. So this is setting up a facility to ensure you have a very kind of highly protected environment at the end of processing for these ready-to-eat products to minimize any risk of recontamination. Preventive maintenance also falls in this category. You may have signage or color-coded equipment related to different operations. So in this example pictured here, these are color-coded tools for use in cleaning equipment that has an allergen versus equipment that doesn't have an allergen, so you don't have any potential cross contact. So best practice, if you have unique allergens, is have dedicated color-coded tools for that allergen containing product. And there may be many other activities, prerequisite programs that are specific to your operation that aren't highlighted here, but just know, there are things outside of good manufacturing practices that would be considered part of your baseline operations that support the implementation of a food safety plan, but also, ensure that you're going to be making a safe product. So I'll just end here talking a little about controlling infectious disease, human infectious disease in the processing environment, related here to human transmission, so worker health and safety, rather than mitigating foodborne illness and contamination of food by employees in the processing environment. And so, this is really, just a piece of what's going on globally related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of concern about potential foodborne transmission of this virus. But we know now that's not a significant risk at all. The risk is really to workers in the food industry and direct transmission from worker to worker. So again, the virus that causes COVID-19 isn't transmitted by food, but we've seen a number of outbreaks in food processing facilities just because of, the lack of control for human to human spread in those environments. And so how to minimize the potential risks of COVID-19 transmission, but, any kind of communicable disease in a facility is, number one, provide training, inform people of the risks and how to mitigate those risks. Similar to what's outlined in the GMPs, no ill worker should be coming to the facility. So having procedures in place to help minimize sick people coming into work. Physical distancing if possible. So giving, more space in between folks working in the facility. Clean and disinfect high touch points. So I think we have a good amount of evidence now showing that there's not a lot of transmission of this virus by surfaces. So a contaminated door handle, for example, being a significant source of infection, but there is potential there. So if you have very high touch points in your facility, best practice is to clean and disinfect those high touch points routinely. Hand washing, really, really critical. So folks should be washing their hands very frequently. And then of course, using personal protective equipment or PPE as recommended. So masking, maybe face shields, whatever is the current recommendation in your area, as well as your employer's requirements. I think we're going to see mask mandates coming back with what's going on with the new variant as well. There are certain disinfectants that have been listed for use against SARS-CoV-2. That's the virus that causes COVID-19. And this list, the list N, is published on the EPA's website. So I think very similar to when you use a sanitizer, you want to make sure you follow the label directions exactly. But also I would recommend checking in with your certifier before you use any of these chemistries, just to ensure that it's allowable and the procedures that you're following meet the organic standards. So if you are going to be disinfecting a food contact surface for any reason, I would say this would be highly unlikely unless you had significant cases in your facility, but you follow kind of a similar approach to cleaning and sanitizing that food contact surface as you would normally, except after you did that initial cleaning step, you would then apply the disinfectant that's labeled as effective against the virus that causes COVID-19. You then rinse off that disinfectant. So these disinfectants are typically going to be much harsher types of chemicals or chemicals at much higher concentrations than are allowed for use on food contact surfaces. So you want to rinse off that residual chemical. And then after that rinsing step, you would apply your normal food contact surface sanitizer as you just normally would. So with that, it kind of wraps up the content for today. I imagine we have a couple of additional questions before we close it out.
Great, thanks, Erin. And yeah, during your presentation, we did have a question come in with someone sort of referring to your example with the liquid eggs in the processing facility and wondering why the cook step is an example, or why the cook step is that example is not a CCP.
So I think it's just maybe a language issue. So under the preventive controls for human food rule, what was kind of, and I think the language there's still a lot of overlap, but if you were looking at a, HACCP regulation, what a critical control point is essentially a process preventive control under the FSMA regulation. So process preventive control, critical control point, pretty much the same thing. So the cook step would be a process preventive control or a critical control point for that particular simple example I gave.
Great, thank you. And then another question is, sometimes you've been talking a lot about cleaning and sanitizing, and sometimes folks have, surfaces in their facilities that are exposed wood or other things that don't, lend themselves to cleaning the same way you might do stainless steel or something like that. What recommendations do you have for those situations?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't always have control over how a facility was built. So, I have heard of some folks concerned because they have a wood wall or a wood ceiling where they're processing food. So, if replacement isn't an option, which I know oftentimes it's not, doing some kind of a treatment on that surface. So if you can paint it, or there's an option to epoxy a surface or something that would make that wood less porous and that surface smooth. So then you could, clean it, sanitize it as necessary. That might be an option. I think, facilities oftentimes are not in our control, as well as kind of the equipment that we have access to. So there, if you're buying used equipment, I would just also do your best to try and ensure that equipment is something that you can clean and sanitize. A lot of times old used equipment will have more of those harborage sites that I mentioned previously. So those areas that are really difficult to clean and sanitize. So, I think if you can, when you're looking at purchasing equipment, do that kind of overview and think about, is this something that I can easily take apart and clean and sanitize? Are there any of those harborage sites there? And try and avoid, problematic equipment to clean, if at all possible.
Great, thank you. And we had another question that came in sort of on the organic farming side of things. Someone was wondering, are there any regional or local opportunities to get trained, especially in certification opportunities for beginning organic farmers or farm managers in the San Joaquin Valley, kind of Stockton area? And so I can speak a little bit to organic training, and Erin, if you want to talk maybe a little bit about food safety training, because I think it's good to hit both of those as a beginning producer, so it's just kind of part of your system. In terms of organic, the CCOF Foundation has a whole lot of online recorded trainings that could be a good introduction into what the organic requirements are. And another really good source for organic and sustainable production practices is the National Center for Appropriate Technology, also called NCAT, and we can send that link out. Yeah, so Erin, what about sort of beginning farmer food safety courses?
Yeah, so I think we're finally kind of coming out of this no in-person training opportunity phase of the pandemic, which is good. But on, for farmers, you have, a different set of food safety regulations to deal with. And so one of the the starting points I try and refer people to is, I have another website It's UC Small Farm Food Safety, and we'll make sure you have the link for that. But we have a partnership with CDFA to provide food safety training opportunities for small scale growers. We don't have a presence exactly where you are, but there are folks distributed across the state that offer a pretty wide range of food safety training opportunities, you know, from just having a conversation to kind of get your bearings around, you know, what's required of you, talk about gaps, all the way up to offering the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule training, and technical assistance around implementing some of those types of procedures. So I would refer you to that website, and you can shoot us an email anytime if you need help. There's a number of other organizations that have food safety support and opportunity as well. I know CCOF Foundation has collaborated a lot with Community Alliance with Family Farmers that offers a ton of different resources related to food safety. And I think they have a lot more information kind of on overlaps between organic requirements and food safety than my group can provide. But hopefully that'll give you kind of a starting point for some folks to reach out to that can give you some support.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to take one last quick question and then move on to our sort of wrap up slides. And one person wrote in who grows plants for medicine and was wondering how much of what you were talking about today relate to the processing of herbs, so like drying flowers, cleaning roots, that type of thing.
So there is a separate federal regulation that applies to dietary supplements, and I think that might be where this particular product falls. And I'm not as familiar with the requirements there, but I think at a minimum, the good manufacturing practices are going to apply for the production of those dietary or nutritional supplements. The other, so that, you know, the process preventive controls or critical control points, I'm not sure, but I don't believe they apply. It's a very different regulation than we have for food, but there is, and I wish I could remember the specific regulation for you. There is a completely separate regulation that applies to dietary supplements. They're actually exempt from the Food Safety Modernization Act because they are dietary supplements. You should be able to find that regulation and some other guidance documents on the UC Food Safety website as well.
Great, thank you very much. We covered a lot of different points there, so thank you for having that breadth of knowledge. So I think we'll move on to kind of wrap things up. And so one thing we want to do is, as Erin mentioned, this is part of a series of trainings, and so we're just curious about what other trainings folks are looking for. We are hoping at the end of this year or possibly early next year to do some in-person training. So if you have any suggestions on what we should do, please go ahead and fill out the poll, and I will give folks a few more seconds to send in their responses. It looks like we have folks interested in many different things, but the preventive controls qualified individual training seems to be the most popular today. So thank you for your feedback, and we'll take that into account as we develop future programming. And then speaking of future programming, we have more webinars coming up this winter and spring. that kind of get more in depth in some of the topics that Erin talked about today, hazard analysis and validation. We'll also do a series on produce safety, or the produce safety rule for growers, and also kind of how that fits into handling as well. And then Erin, do you want to talk a little bit about the opportunity you have, another opportunity to get feedback?
Another feedback opportunity. So I'm in the process of developing an online food safety training course to hopefully fulfill, that training requirement under the preventive controls for human food rules. So right now we're just looking for feedback if to see if the content that we're developing would be of use to people, if there are topics that we shouldn't include or should add. So if you're interested, you can shoot me an email, or the contact information for the student working on the project is here below. It would be a less than 1 hour interview, just to give us your perspectives, and we'll compensate you for your time. So if you're interested, please reach out.
Great, thank you. And just to let you know, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar after we get it up on our YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel is also a really good place to find past recordings. We have a whole library of past webinars on food safety topics and organic topics and many other things. So check those out. And with that, we will wrap things up. So thank you very much for attending, and you have one more opportunity to get feedback when you close out of the webinar. Evaluation form will pop up, and we'd love to hear from you, see how we can improve future offerings, as well as get additional ideas for the types of trainings folks are looking for. So Erin, thank you again. I know this is a super busy time of year, so thank you for taking an hour and a half to walk us through good manufacturing practices, and have a good afternoon.